Hello, my dear friends and fellow literature enthusiasts. I'm so glad you've joined me today, settling in with a warm cup of tea, or perhaps a notebook nearby, ready to wander with me through the intricate world of cinema. Today, I want to share with you a journey into a film that struck a unique chord in my imagination, one that melds myth, culture, and human emotion in ways that feel both timeless and profoundly personal, Black Panther from 2018. But before we dive in, I just want to say, from the heart, that if you enjoy these explorations, these deep dives into the narrative, philosophical, and literary layers of film, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. No pressure at all, but your support helps me continue to create spaces where we can reflect, question, and connect over stories that truly resonate. Now, I want to make something clear from the outset. This isn't going to be a conventional movie review. This isn't about star ratings, box office numbers, or the latest trends. What I hope to offer instead is a deeply intellectual and critical analysis, a reflection that leans into the literary, the symbolic, the cultural, and, most importantly, the personal. Think of it as an invitation to walk alongside me in the spaces where storytelling, philosophy, and lived experience intersect. Consider this less a review and more a meditation, a thoughtful conversation among friends who care about meaning, nuance, and narrative artistry. When I first encountered this film, I'll admit, I wasn't sure what to expect. Like many, I had heard the buzz, seen the trailers, noted the excitement swirling around it. But it wasn't the spectacle that ultimately captured me, it was something more subtle, something quietly profound. From the very first frame, there's a sense of place and history, of a world that feels both imagined and lived in. It's as though the filmmakers were not just crafting a story for the screen, but offering a doorway into a rich, layered tapestry of culture, heritage, and identity. And I remember feeling that pull instantly, a kind of recognition that this film was going to challenge me, not just as a viewer, but as someone who reads the world through stories, through symbols, through the lens of literature and human experience. At its heart, this story is about a young man named T'Challa, a prince who inherits not only the mantle of leadership but also the profound responsibility that comes with it. I've always been fascinated by narratives of succession, of stepping into roles we might not feel fully ready for. There's something universally human about that moment, the mix of fear, courage, hope, and self-doubt. And watching him navigate that terrain reminded me of my own experiences stepping into spaces where the stakes felt enormous, where the expectations of others and the weight of one's own conscience collided. The world he inhabits is Wakanda, a nation that, on its surface, could almost be mistaken for a fantastical utopia. But as any attentive observer of literature will recognize, utopias are never simple. There's complexity here, layers of politics, ethics, and history embedded in the very soil of the land. The filmmakers invite us to consider what it means to build a society that is hidden from the world, a society both advanced and deeply rooted in tradition. It made me think about how every culture carries with it a constellation of values, choices, and tensions, and how literature often uses fictional worlds to reflect on our own. There's a poetry in seeing a technologically advanced kingdom remain connected to its past, its myths, and its moral compass, and I found myself pondering the delicate balance between progress and preservation, something I've wrestled with in my own life and readings. The plot, in its most basic form, is thrilling yet deeply human. After the death of his father, our protagonist ascends to the throne, facing immediate pressures both external and internal. He must embody the ideals of leadership while grappling with personal loss, questions of justice, and the shadows of his father's decisions. Then comes Eric Killmonger, a character whose presence is electric, whose motives are complex and piercing. I don't want to spoil too much, but suffice it to say, his entrance into the story challenges every assumption the audience, and T'Challa himself, may have about morality, heritage, and the nature of power. Watching their confrontation felt like reading a layered tragedy or a morally ambiguous novel. It's the kind of tension that lingers long after the credits roll, compelling you to revisit the themes, to interrogate your own judgments and biases. One of the things I found most fascinating is how the film intertwines global themes with intensely personal stakes. On the one hand, there's the political allegory, a nation guarding its wealth, knowledge, and resources, debating whether to share them with the wider world or retreat behind its borders. On the other, there's the intimate story of identity, of belonging, of legacy. Chala's journey feels not only heroic but deeply reflective. It asks us to consider, what do we owe to those who came before us? To those who will come after? How do we reconcile personal desires with collective responsibility? In many ways, this mirrors the questions literature has asked humanity for centuries, whether through epic poetry, philosophical treatises, or the nuanced novels that explore the spaces between individual and society. I have to admit, the visual storytelling in this film resonated with me in ways I hadn't anticipated. There's a rhythm to the cinematography, a careful choreography that feels almost literary in its composition. Every shot seems deliberate, every color choice imbued with meaning. Golds and purples, vibrant blues and deep shadows. They don't just create a beautiful palette. They reflect the inner landscapes of the characters, their emotional states, and the cultural richness of the world they inhabit. I remember pausing during one scene, just letting the images sink in, and feeling a profound sense of awe. It was as though the filmmakers were speaking in a visual language I could feel in my chest, a language that complements narrative and dialogue rather than merely illustrating it. And then there's the music. Oh, the music. It's impossible not to be swept away by the way traditional African rhythms, modern compositions, and powerful orchestration intertwine. The soundtrack doesn't simply accompany the story, it amplifies it, giving voice to unspoken emotions, ancestral echoes, and the weight of history. I've always believed that sound can function much like poetry, and in this film, it does exactly that. It adds layers of meaning, resonance, and memory to every scene. Listening to it, I was transported in ways that made me reflect not just on the story, but on the ways sound shapes our perception of narrative itself. Now, I want to offer a brief sketch of the plot, not to summarize for those who haven't seen it, but to provide a scaffold for the analysis we'll explore together. As Chala assumes the throne, he faces challenges to his rule both from within and beyond Wakanda's borders. There are moments of intense action, yes. Chases, battles, strategic confrontations, but these are never mere spectacle. Each encounter is a test of character, ethics, and leadership. And when Killmonger arrives, bringing with him a vision of justice that is both provocative and unsettling, the stakes are raised in ways that ripple through the narrative and the emotional core of the film. Their confrontation isn't just physical, it's philosophical. It's a debate rendered in flesh and fury, in choices that force both characters and viewers to grapple with complex moral landscapes. What struck me personally, and continues to linger in my mind, is the film's insistence on complicating what we might instinctively label as good and evil. In literature, we often admire works that resist simplicity, that revel in ambiguity, and this story does exactly that. Killmonger's motivations, his pain, and his desire for recognition and reparation make him a character we can empathize with, even if we don't condone his methods. And Chala's leadership is not portrayed as infallible. He wrestles with doubt, with guilt, and with the responsibility to act in ways that honor both tradition and innovation. This duality, the interplay of right and wrong, hope and despair, is what gives the narrative its literary richness. It's a story that doesn't hand us answers. It invites us to think, to question, to feel, and to interpret. I also want to touch on how identity is explored in the film, because for me, this was deeply moving. There's a constant dialogue between past and present, between heritage and individual choice. The film asks us to consider what we inherit and what we choose to carry forward. How much of our path is dictated by the world we're born into, and how much is shaped by the decisions we make when confronted with that inheritance? These are questions that literature asks in countless forms, yet seeing them visualized in such a dynamic, cinematic context felt both new and familiar. It made me reflect on my own experiences of reconciling who I am with where I come from, and how that tension shapes the way we move through the world. And then there's the element of secrecy, of hidden knowledge. Wakanda is cloaked, not only in invisibility but in the mysteries of its culture and technology. This secrecy, and the ethical questions it raises, reminded me of so many literary explorations of hidden societies, secret histories, and the moral dilemmas they provoke. How much should one reveal? How much responsibility does one bear toward the outside world? The film treats these questions with nuance, never reducing them to simple answers, and in doing so, it invites viewers, particularly those attuned to literature and critical thought, to engage actively with the material. The emotional resonance of the story is further amplified by its relationships: family, friendship, loyalty, and love. Chala's connections are not superficial, they are woven into the moral and philosophical fabric of the story. Each interaction, each dialogue, is charged with layers of meaning. I found myself thinking about how relationships in literature often function as mirrors, reflecting our values, our doubts, and our deepest yearnings. Here, the film achieves a similar effect, using human connection as both plot mechanism and ethical compass. It made me reflect on my own bonds, the ways in which they shape and define the choices I make, the person I strive to be. One of the film's most brilliant achievements, in my opinion, is its seamless blending of myth and reality. There is a mythic quality to the characters, the setting, and the stakes, yet it is grounded in emotions and dilemmas that feel entirely real. This tension between the legendary and the lived experience is something literature has long sought to capture, from epic poems to modernist novels. And seeing it executed on screen with such care and artistry was deeply satisfying. It reminded me why storytelling matters, why myths endure, and why even the most fantastical narratives can illuminate truths about our world, our societies, and ourselves. As we move into the analysis proper, I want to leave you with a sense of anticipation, a sense of curiosity about the layers we're going to explore together. There are major twists, yes, and revelatory moments that reshape our understanding of the characters and their world. But these are not mere surprises for entertainment's sake. They are narrative devices that challenge us to think critically, to reflect on morality, culture, and the ways in which our own biases shape our perception of justice and heroism. Watching these unfold, I felt a profound engagement, as though the film were inviting me into a dialogue, asking me to interrogate the nature of power, legacy, and human connection. I hope that as we continue our exploration, you'll feel that same invitation. I want us to linger on questions, to celebrate the poetry in the visuals, the philosophy in the dialogue, and the humanity in the characters. We'll consider the ways the story intersects with history, myth, and ethical philosophy. We'll examine the symbolism embedded in every design choice, every costume, every moment of silence, as well as the resonance of action sequences that, on first glance, might seem purely thrilling. Most importantly, we'll do this together, not as critics behind a screen, but as friends, thinkers, and readers who find joy and insight in the layered textures of narrative. So, let's settle in, open our minds, and allow ourselves to be both spectators and participants. Let's be moved, challenged, and inspired. Let's think deeply about inheritance, identity, justice, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we might become. And as we journey together, I promise to share not only my observations and interpretations, but also my own reflections, the ways in which this story has lingered with me, shifted my perspective, and invited me to reconsider what it means to lead, to connect, and to act with conscience in a complex world. Because at the end of the day, isn't that what literature, film, and storytelling in all forms aspire to do? To remind us that our lives, our choices, and our experiences are part of larger narratives, some imagined, some inherited, some created, and that engaging with them thoughtfully enriches both our minds and our hearts. As we move forward, I invite you to remain curious, to question, and to reflect. Let us celebrate the artistry, the vision, and the humanity captured in this story, and let us allow it to resonate in ways that are both personal and profoundly intellectual. Together, we'll uncover the hidden layers, explore the moral complexities, and appreciate the beauty and depth that make this film such a remarkable cultural and narrative achievement. And with that, my friends, let's begin our deeper dive. Let's explore the symbolism, the philosophy, and the emotional resonance that make this story not just entertaining, but a rich, thought-provoking text worthy of study, reflection, and admiration. When I first revisited this story, I found myself struck not just by its surface thrill, the dramatic entrances, the lush visuals, the kinetic energy of the action, but by the way it carefully lays the foundation for everything that follows. There's a rhythm to the unfolding, a deliberate pacing that allows the audience to breathe in the textures of Wakanda while simultaneously feeling the mounting pressure on its new king. It's a world that demands attention, a narrative that rewards patience, and I found myself swept along by the richness of its details. The film opens with a prologue that immediately sets a tone both epic and intimate. We are transported back centuries, to a time when the ancestors of Wakanda discovered vibranium, a metal so extraordinary that it would define the fate of their people for generations. I remember sitting there, thinking about how often our myths and legends serve as mirrors of our present struggles. Even in these ancient frames, there's a reflection of human ambition, fear, and ingenuity. The elders of Wakanda, portrayed with a kind of solemn grace, debate the responsibility that comes with such power, to hide or to share, to preserve or to intervene. It's a moral quandary that resonates far beyond the fantasy of the setting, and I found myself pondering it deeply, thinking about the secrets societies keep, the knowledge that is hoarded, and the ethical responsibilities that accompany extraordinary privilege. From there, the narrative transitions to modern times, but the echoes of the past linger in every frame. We meet T'Challa as he returns home to Wakanda following the death of his father, a king who embodied both wisdom and the weight of tradition. The portrayal of grief here is subtle yet affecting. It's not the kind of grief that erupts in loud lamentation. Rather, it's the quiet kind that presses on the chest, the kind that follows you into every room, every decision, every glance. Watching T'Challa navigate the funeral rites and the ceremonial preparations for his ascension felt profoundly human. I was reminded of literature's finest meditations on loss, how it shapes identity, informs choices, and colors the way we see the world. In many ways, T'Challa's mourning is a bridge, connecting the ancient legacies of his people with the contemporary responsibilities that now rest on his shoulders. One of the first key developments is the ritual combat for the throne, a scene that, at first glance, could seem purely theatrical but is in fact rich with cultural and ethical significance. We see T'Challa stepping into a space charged with history, tradition, and the scrutiny of his peers. There's a tension here between personal capability and inherited authority, a theme that literature often explores in the context of dynastic succession, heroic journeys, or moral apprenticeship. The combat itself is fierce, precise, and visually striking, but what resonated most with me was the way it framed T'Challa's inner state. He is not just fighting for a crown, he is negotiating his place within a lineage, confronting the expectations of his ancestors, and confronting his own fears about leadership. I remember thinking that this is a cinematic moment where physical struggle and ethical responsibility become inseparable, a motif that recurs throughout the film. Following his ascension, we are invited to explore Wakanda in all its complexity. I have to pause here and marvel at the way the filmmakers convey this world. It is a place of contradictions, technologically advanced yet deeply rooted in cultural rituals, vibrant yet secluded, powerful yet vulnerable to the moral questions that come with such power. We see the people, the marketplaces, the ceremonial spaces, and the hidden laboratories where vibranium is studied. The cinematography and production design work together to immerse us fully, but there's more than mere spectacle at play. Each detail, the costume design, the architecture, the communal rituals, speaks to a society that has carefully negotiated its values over generations. It reminded me of the worlds constructed in literature, where every detail is laden with significance, and every object, gesture, or phrase hints at broader thematic concerns. One of the earliest key events that sets the narrative tension is the emergence of a new threat, embodied in the character of Ulysses Klaue. His introduction is brief, but electrifying, and it immediately establishes the stakes beyond Wakanda's borders. I've always been intrigued by how literature and cinema use antagonists to illuminate the ethical landscape of the protagonist's world. Here, Klaue functions almost like a narrative mirror, reflecting the dangers that arise when greed, ambition, and recklessness collide with the moral and cultural codes that Wakanda seeks to uphold. His theft of vibranium from the nation is not only an act of physical aggression but also a symbolic rupture, a reminder that even the most hidden societies are never entirely immune to the forces of the outside world. The plot then shifts to Chala's pursuit of justice, which is simultaneously a personal quest and a duty of state. His decision to track Clow across international borders allows the story to explore the intersection of global politics, morality, and personal responsibility. I was particularly struck by the way the narrative handles this pursuit. It is neither simplistic nor sensationalized. Each encounter, each confrontation, reveals more about Chala's character, his principles, and the weight of expectation he carries. I remember reflecting on how, in literature, journeys often serve dual purposes. They are both literal and metaphorical, external and internal. This pursuit is no different. It is a journey that tests skill, judgment, and ethical fortitude, while also revealing the young king's values and vulnerabilities. In the midst of these international stakes, we are introduced to Nakia, a character whose presence adds both emotional depth and ideological counterpoint. Nakia is a spy, a humanitarian, and a lover, all at once, and her motivations frequently challenge Chala to think beyond tradition, beyond duty, beyond the walls of Wakanda. Her insistence on helping those outside their borders, her compassion, and her vision of a more engaged world force the young king to confront difficult questions. To what extent should Wakanda intervene? What obligations do power and privilege confer? I found her character deeply moving because she embodies a moral imagination that is not constrained by nationalism or comfort. She is a reminder that literature and film often relies on such figures to expand the protagonist's horizon, to provoke reflection, and to complicate seemingly straightforward ethical choices. Another significant development is Chala's engagement with Shuri, his younger sister, whose brilliance and playfulness provide both comic relief and critical insight into the technological prowess of Wakanda. Watching her, I was struck by how the film weaves intellect and emotion together. Shuri is not a side character, she is an integral voice in the story, demonstrating how innovation and ethical responsibility must coexist. There's a moment when she teases her brother, challenges his assumptions, and reveals the cutting-edge advancements of their nation, and it felt, to me, like the narrative's way of underscoring the theme of progress tempered by reflection, a recurring motif in literature that examines the tension between knowledge and morality. Of course, the narrative tension escalates further when Clow is finally confronted, not merely as an obstacle but as a catalyst for revealing hidden loyalties, past betrayals, and unforeseen alliances. The confrontation is both physical and psychological, and it serves to test Chala's judgment, restraint, and capacity for mercy. I remember watching the sequence and feeling a profound appreciation for the storytelling craft. It is a reminder that action scenes can carry moral weight, that combat can be a dialogue in itself, and that every decision on the battlefield is also a decision about character. From this point, the narrative deepens with the introduction of Eric Killmonger, whose presence is electric and unsettling. His arrival is not just an escalation of conflict. It is an ethical and ideological challenge that forces Chala and the audience to reconsider notions of justice, heritage, and the responsibilities of power. Killmonger's charisma, pain, and ambition make him a figure who cannot be dismissed as purely villainous. Instead, he embodies the complexities of a world where historical wrongs and personal grievances intertwine, where the line between right and wrong is not fixed but contested. I remember reflecting as the scenes unfolded on how literature often presents such characters not merely to entertain, but to provoke critical thought, to make us question our own assumptions, and to examine the moral architecture of society itself. As the tension builds, the film also allows moments of introspection and reflection, where Chala engages with the memory of his father and the wisdom of his ancestors. These moments are quiet, almost meditative, yet they carry immense weight. In literature, these kinds of reflective interludes often serve to anchor the narrative, to provide insight into the protagonist's inner life, and to remind us that heroism is as much about thoughtfulness and moral deliberation as it is about action. In these sequences, I found myself drawn to the dialogue between tradition and innovation, between inherited wisdom and contemporary necessity. It's a tension that resonates deeply with anyone who has ever navigated the spaces between legacy and personal choice. One of the most memorable and thematically rich sequences involves the ritual challenge for the throne, where Chala is confronted by an unexpected challenger. The scene is charged with both spectacle and symbolic weight. Every movement, every strike, every glance carries meaning. The fight is not merely a test of strength. It is a negotiation of identity, of right to rule, and of the values that define a society. As I watched, I couldn't help but think of classical literature, where contests for kingship are never only physical, they are deeply moral and ethical engagements, tests of character that reveal the true nature of leadership. The choreography of this sequence, combined with its narrative significance, made it one of the film's most compelling explorations of duty, courage, and moral complexity. Alongside these major events, there are countless smaller, yet no less significant moments that enrich the narrative tapestry. The interactions among the royal council, the ceremonial exchanges with neighboring tribes, and the intimate conversations between T'Challa and his allies all contribute to a sense of layered realism. These details are reminiscent of literary world-building, where each interaction, no matter how minor it seems, reinforces themes, develops character, and advances the moral and philosophical undercurrents of the story. I found myself captivated by the depth and care with which these moments were rendered, appreciating the filmmaker's commitment to creating a world that feels alive, internally consistent, and morally resonant. As the narrative progresses, the stakes continue to rise. T'Challa is forced to navigate political intrigue, personal doubt, and the looming presence of a challenger whose skills and vision are formidable. Each confrontation, whether in council chambers, on the streets of Johannesburg, or within the hidden enclaves of Wakanda, serves to illuminate different facets of his character. What I found most compelling was the way the story balances action with reflection, spectacle with substance. There is never a moment of narrative indulgence. Even the most thrilling sequences are carefully integrated into the moral and thematic architecture of the film. As the narrative continues to unfold, the story takes on a more urgent, almost breathless quality. The sense of a kingdom teetering on the brink becomes palpable, not just through the explicit threats from enemies, but through the quiet tension that rests on the shoulders of those who are entrusted with leadership. There's a profound intimacy in these moments, the kind that makes you lean closer to the screen, not because of danger or spectacle, but because you feel the weight of every decision, every glance, every hesitation. T'Challa is no longer merely a king in training. He is a ruler confronting the raw realities of authority, responsibility, and the often painful moral compromises that accompany power. One of the pivotal developments occurs when the nature of Wakanda's isolationist policies comes under scrutiny. Killmonger's challenge forces a re-evaluation, not only politically but ethically. His confrontations are sharp, intelligent, and deeply unsettling because they reveal how unchecked pain and unaddressed historical injustice can metastasize into something both charismatic and terrifying. It's not merely a personal vendetta. It's a reckoning, a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about power, heritage, and the consequences of choosing safety over engagement. Watching these confrontations unfold, I found myself reflecting on literary narratives where protagonists are challenged not only by external forces but by internal dilemmas and inherited legacies, the kind that demand moral courage and intellectual clarity. The tension escalates further in a sequence that is visually stunning yet narratively potent. The challenge for the throne becomes more than a ceremonial rite. It is a crucible in which the identities, values, and futures of the characters are tested. Every movement in this sequence carries symbolic weight. T'Challa's combat with Killmonger is not only about physical supremacy, it is a clash of worldviews, ethics, and visions for the future. As I watched, I could not help but recall the great literary duels where words, choices, and ideology weigh as heavily as swords. The choreography of the fight, combined with its moral and thematic implications, transforms it into a meditation on what it means to lead, to reconcile pain with justice, and to confront the allure of vengeance. In the midst of this conflict, the story gives space to the people of Wakanda, their voices, and their responses. The council, the tribes, and the broader populace are not passive observers. They are active participants in shaping the moral arc of the narrative. There's a sequence where allegiance, tradition, and conscience collide, and it felt to me like a masterclass in illustrating how leadership is inseparable from community. The filmmakers, much like a novelist, invest in the texture of society itself, reminding us that a ruler's choices are inseparable from the collective moral fabric of the people they govern. I found these moments profoundly resonant, especially as literature often emphasizes that character is revealed not only in isolation but in relation to the broader human network. A critical twist occurs as Killmonger seizes control, temporarily turning Wakanda's traditions and power structures against their intended purpose. The visual and emotional impact of this moment is extraordinary. It's a stark reminder of how fragile even the most carefully constructed societies can be when internal and external pressures collide. There's a haunting elegance to the way the narrative portrays his victory. It is not revelry or mindless triumph, but a carefully measured assertion of ideology, a chilling exploration of how pain can be weaponized, how legitimate grievances can metastasize into destructive ambition. I remember feeling a mixture of awe, tension, and sorrow watching this unfold, recognizing the narrative sophistication in presenting a villainous triumph as both terrifying and deeply human. Amid this darkness, the story allows for moments of reflection and resurgence. T'Challa is not defeated in spirit, and the narrative takes care to explore the internal landscapes of the characters during their moments of exile, injury, or contemplation. These interludes are not slowdowns. Rather, they are spaces where the emotional and ethical stakes crystallize, where the audience is invited to dwell on questions of forgiveness, redemption, and the enduring bonds of family and community. I was struck by how these quieter moments carry almost as much narrative power as the grand spectacles of combat, highlighting the literary truth that reflection and inner struggle often define the trajectory of heroism as much as external action. One particularly compelling sequence is T'Challa's journey into the ancestral plane, a metaphysical and deeply spiritual experience that bridges the temporal and the ethical. Here, the story shifts into a contemplative register, and the dialogue with his father offers not just guidance but also an exploration of the moral frameworks that underlie leadership. The imagery and dialogue are poetic, the visual language almost literary in its careful layering of symbolism and meaning. I found myself thinking about how literature frequently employs such mystical or reflective interludes to allow protagonists and audiences to grapple with existential and ethical questions that cannot be answered through action alone. This sequence reminded me that the narrative is as much about introspection and moral philosophy as it is about heroism and spectacle. As T'Challa emerges from this introspective crucible, the narrative momentum shifts toward resolution, yet the story resists rushing. The tension remains palpable, and each character's motivations, fears, and loyalties are brought into sharp relief. Strategic alliances are reconsidered, moral choices are revisited, and the groundwork is laid for the climactic confrontations that will define the kingdom's future. The story's pacing is masterful here. It builds suspense not merely through external threats, but through the ethical and psychological pressures weighing on each character. Watching it, I was reminded of novels where the final chapters are less about the speed of events and more about the precision of revelation, the careful unspooling of character arcs, and the ultimate reconciliation of themes. The climactic sequences are both exhilarating and intellectually engaging. The confrontation between T'Challa and Killmonger is not just a fight, it is the culmination of ideological, personal, and ethical conflicts that have been simmering since the beginning. The choreography of the battle, the strategy, and the emotional stakes converge to create a moment that is viscerally exciting yet thematically profound. I was particularly impressed by the way the narrative allows Killmonger's perspective to remain coherent and compelling even in defeat, a reminder that well-crafted antagonists are not simply obstacles to be overcome, but catalysts for reflection and growth. In literature, the most memorable conflicts often retain moral ambiguity, and this story embodies that principle beautifully. Following this confrontation, the narrative turns its attention to restoration and reconciliation. Wakanda, though battered and challenged, emerges as a society poised for renewal. The story explores how communities can navigate trauma, honor tradition, and embrace change, and I found these sequences deeply moving. There's a moment of communal deliberation, a recognition of past mistakes, and an articulation of a new vision that balances innovation with ethical responsibility. These elements resonated with me as a reader and viewer, recalling narratives where societies evolve not through easy victories but through thoughtful reflection, dialogue, and collective moral reckoning. The resolution also addresses the broader ethical implications of Wakanda's isolationist past. Chala's decisions about engagement with the world are thoughtful, deliberate, and hopeful, suggesting a nuanced understanding of power and responsibility. I remember reflecting on how literature often presents such resolutions not as simplistic happy endings, but as ethically complex conclusions that honor both the triumphs and the sacrifices of the journey. The story's conclusion felt satisfying not because all problems were erased, but because the characters, and by extension the audience, are invited to grapple with the moral and philosophical consequences of their choices. Throughout these developments, the film continues to balance spectacle with reflection, action with moral inquiry. The political intrigue, the personal struggles, and the ideological confrontations are interwoven seamlessly, creating a narrative that is as intellectually stimulating as it is emotionally engaging. I found myself repeatedly impressed by the way the story refuses to shy away from complexity. The triumphs are hard-won, the moral dilemmas are unresolved, and the characters are allowed to inhabit shades of gray, much like the most compelling protagonists in literature. One of the final elements that struck me was the careful attention to legacy and memory. Chala's interactions with both the living and the departed, the rituals that honor ancestors, and the cultural markers that define Wakanda all serve to underscore the narrative's commitment to depth and continuity. These moments are not merely decorative, they are integral to understanding how the story conceives of leadership, morality, and societal cohesion. I found these sequences profoundly resonant because they highlight a truth often explored in literature, that identity and responsibility are inseparable from history, memory, and the ongoing dialogue between past and present. Even the smaller moments of human connection, between siblings, lovers, and allies, carry immense weight. They remind the audience that amidst political upheaval and epic battles, the personal stakes remain vital. These interactions provide emotional grounding, illustrating how empathy, loyalty, and love are inextricably linked to the larger ethical and political struggles. I found these portrayals deeply moving as they reinforce the narrative's insistence that heroism and wisdom are as much about human connection as they are about courage or strategy. By the story's close, the resolution is multifaceted and intellectually satisfying. Conflicts are addressed, but the narrative leaves room for reflection on broader ethical, political, and social questions. The characters have grown, societies have shifted, and the audience is invited to carry forward the philosophical inquiries that the film has nurtured. Watching it, I felt a deep sense of completion, not because every problem was solved, but because the narrative had honored the complexity, beauty, and moral ambiguity of its world. It reminded me, again, of literature's finest achievements, the ability to entertain, to provoke thought, and to leave one contemplating long after the story has ended. In reflecting on the resolution, I also considered the narrative's engagement with identity, belonging, and justice. The story does not offer simplistic solutions, nor does it rely on easy binaries of good versus evil. Instead, it presents a nuanced exploration of how personal history, societal structures, and ethical frameworks intersect to shape choices and consequences. I found this intellectually stimulating and emotionally satisfying because it aligns with the kinds of inquiries that literature encourages. How do we reconcile power with responsibility? How do we address historical wrongs without perpetuating new harms? How do we navigate the tension between tradition and progress? These questions linger, making the story both entertaining and profoundly thought-provoking. Finally, the narrative concludes on a note of cautious optimism, suggesting that the future is neither predetermined nor fixed, but shaped by deliberate choice, ethical reflection, and courageous action. There is a sense that while challenges remain, the characters, and by extension, the audience, are better equipped to navigate the complexities of the world. I was left with a profound appreciation for how the story balances spectacle, reflection, and moral inquiry, and for the way it invites the audience to consider their own responsibilities, values, and vision for the future. When I consider the tapestry of characters in this narrative, I am always struck by the depth and nuance with which each one is constructed. These are not merely figures in a story moving from point A to point B. They are living, breathing entities, full of contradictions, history, and aspiration. From the moment they appear, it is clear that each character is carefully crafted to challenge, illuminate, and reflect upon both the world they inhabit and the one we, as viewers, carry with us into the story. I often find myself pausing during certain scenes, not because of spectacle or action, but because I am so captivated by the intricacy of a glance, a hesitation, or a line of dialogue that resonates on an almost literary level. Chala, as the central figure, is immediately compelling because he embodies the tension between inherited responsibility and personal conviction. From the outset, he is defined by a profound sense of duty, a quiet moral compass, and a measured temperament. Yet beneath this controlled exterior lies a swirling current of doubt, reflection, and sometimes uncertainty. Watching him navigate the weight of kingship, I am reminded of the archetypal literary hero whose external journey is inseparable from an internal one. His struggles are not only about confronting external enemies but about understanding the limits and possibilities of power, leadership, and justice. There is an intimacy in observing his process of grappling with these questions, a sense that the audience is invited into the very architecture of his thought. What fascinates me most about Chala is his ability to balance empathy with decisiveness. In many ways, his character is a meditation on the nature of leadership itself. He is not flawless, nor is he intended to be. His moments of hesitation, reflection, or moral wrestling are integral to his authenticity. I find myself relating to him, perhaps because his challenges are fundamentally human. How to honor tradition while embracing change, how to wield authority without succumbing to ego, and how to reconcile personal loss with societal responsibility. These dilemmas give his character a literary richness, echoing the classic tension between individual conscience and collective expectation that appears in so many great novels. Killmonger is an equally magnetic presence, though in a very different register. He is electrifying because he embodies both the seductive allure and the devastating consequences of unaddressed pain. From the beginning, his charisma is undeniable. He speaks with clarity, intelligence, and conviction, and it is immediately apparent that his rage is grounded in lived experience, personal trauma, and historical injustice. Unlike conventional villains, he is not simply motivated by greed or cruelty. He represents a force that forces others, and the audience, to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality, oppression, and the long shadows of history. There is a tragic beauty in this, a literary quality that transforms him into more than a foil for the hero. He is a mirror reflecting the consequences of neglect, the hazards of moral absolutism, and the complexities of justice. What is particularly compelling about Killmonger is the way the narrative allows his motivations to remain coherent, even when his methods are extreme. Watching him, I often found myself wrestling with conflicting emotions: admiration for his eloquence and intelligence, sorrow for his suffering, and fear at the scope of his ambition. It is rare for a story to present such moral complexity without diminishing the stakes or clarity of conflict, and yet here it is handled with masterful subtlety. In literature, the most memorable antagonists are rarely one-dimensional. They challenge the protagonist and the audience alike to rethink assumptions about morality, loyalty, and justice. Shuri, Chala's sister, is another character whose vibrancy and intellect bring immense energy to the narrative. I have always been enchanted by her ability to merge playfulness with brilliance. She is, in many ways, the story's embodiment of curiosity and innovation. Her scenes often provide moments of levity, but they are never trivial. Every joke, every experimental device, every playful exchange is undergirded by profound intelligence and a fearless engagement with knowledge. I find her character resonates deeply because she challenges the stereotype of the genius in stories. She is fully human, emotionally rich, socially perceptive, and capable of both profound insight and genuine silliness. In literary terms, she serves as a reminder that intelligence is not merely a tool for problem-solving but a lens through which to experience the world with joy, wonder, and moral curiosity. Nakia, Chala's love interest, adds yet another layer of thematic and emotional depth. She is courageous, principled, and unflinchingly committed to a vision of justice that transcends personal ambition. What makes her character particularly compelling is the way she occupies moral and ethical spaces that are often neglected in mainstream narratives. She challenges Chala, not through confrontation or antagonism, but through subtle insistence on integrity, compassion, and global responsibility. I often found myself reflecting on how literature frequently employs such characters to embody conscience, perspective, or the ethical counterpoint to the hero's journey. Nakia's presence reminds us that leadership and heroism are relational, dependent not only on individual valor but also on the voices and insights of those who insist on doing what is right, even when inconvenient or difficult. Ramonda, the Queen Mother, is a figure of stability, wisdom, and quiet resilience. Her role often operates in a different register. She does not dominate scenes with action or rhetoric, yet her presence carries enormous narrative weight. She embodies the intersection of memory, legacy, and moral authority. I have always been drawn to such characters because they function as anchors, reminding both the protagonist and the audience of the continuity of history, the necessity of perspective, and the subtle forms of influence that sustain societies. In literature, these figures often operate in the background, yet their impact is profound. They guide, caution, and inspire through lived experience, offering the kind of wisdom that cannot be manufactured but only earned. Everett K. Ross, though less central than the royal family, provides another dimension, the lens of the outside world, the perspective of someone navigating unfamiliar cultural and political landscapes. His character is charming, understated, and often humorous, yet he serves a critical narrative function. Through him, the audience is reminded that there is a larger context beyond the confines of Wakanda, and that understanding, alliance, and ethical engagement require humility, observation, and courage. I was particularly struck by the way his presence reinforces a literary principle, that every character, no matter their apparent narrative weight, can illuminate themes, provide moral contrast, and catalyze reflection in unexpected ways. The supporting cast, Wabi, Okoye, M'Baku, and the other tribal leaders, contribute layers of texture, ideological diversity, and cultural complexity. Each is written with nuance and individuality, embodying particular ethical, political, or philosophical stances. Wabi's loyalty, Okoye's martial skill and honor, and M'Baku's initially antagonistic strength all serve to demonstrate that power and virtue are multifaceted. The narrative takes care to avoid caricature, presenting each figure as fully realized, capable of both wisdom and error, pride and humility. Observing their interactions, conflicts, and eventual resolutions, I was reminded of how ensemble casts in literature provide both texture and thematic richness, illustrating that the moral and emotional arcs of a society are constructed through the interplay of many voices, not just the protagonists. The relationship dynamics are particularly fascinating. The interplay between Chala and Killmonger, for instance, is not merely adversarial. It is almost fraternal, a tragic confrontation between two sides of the same historical and ethical coin. I was often reminded of classic literary sibling rivalries, mythological confrontations, and ethical duels, where the conflict is both personal and universal. Similarly, Chala's interactions with Nakia, Shuri, and the Royal Council highlight the relational dimension of leadership. One does not act alone, and one's ethical and emotional decisions ripple through the lives of others. These interactions are rendered with attention to subtlety and nuance, making the story's moral and psychological stakes feel intensely real. I found myself particularly intrigued by the theme of legacy as embodied in the characters. Chala, Shuri, and Ramonda each represent different facets of inheritance, of power, wisdom, and cultural memory. Killmonger embodies the shadow side of legacy, the unaddressed pain and systemic injustice that fester when history is neglected. Nakia represents the future-oriented perspective, the conscious choice to act ethically in a global and relational context. Each character is, in this sense, a lens through which the story interrogates time, memory, and responsibility. I found this deeply resonant, as literature often uses character as a vehicle to explore philosophical and ethical questions, offering insight not only into individual psychology but into the moral architecture of societies. The villains, while central to the narrative tension, are crafted with an elegance that invites reflection rather than simple condemnation. Killmonger's choices, for example, are horrifying in method but intellectually and emotionally coherent in motivation. He forces the audience to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, retribution, and the consequences of systemic neglect. His charisma, intelligence, and depth ensure that he is neither a simple obstacle nor a cautionary caricature. He is a mirror reflecting the consequences of both personal and societal failures. Literary analysis often emphasizes that the most compelling antagonists reveal truths about the protagonist and society itself, and here, that principle is realized with brilliance. Even the minor characters, guards, scientists, and community members, are imbued with individuality and ethical resonance. The narrative refuses to flatten their roles into mere functional utility. Each has voice, perspective, and stakes. I was particularly impressed by how this mirrors the literary technique of ensemble storytelling, where even peripheral figures contribute to the thematic, ethical, and emotional landscape. The result is a world that feels lived in, ethically complex, and intellectually engaging. A recurring motif in character construction is duality. Many figures embody contrasts, strength and vulnerability, tradition and innovation, rage and compassion. Chala and Killmonger exemplify this most vividly, yet it is echoed across the cast in smaller but no less significant ways. This attention to duality renders the story rich with literary resonance. It is not merely a battle of good versus evil, but a meditation on the interplay of forces within individuals, societies, and histories. Watching these contrasts play out, I found myself contemplating how literature uses duality to explore the complexity of human nature, morality, and cultural evolution. I was particularly struck by the evolution of Chala's understanding of justice and responsibility. His encounters with each character, ally, adversary, or observer, serve as catalysts for reflection and growth. He learns that leadership is not simply about enforcing rules, defending territory, or asserting power. It is about listening, empathizing, integrating diverse perspectives, and making ethically coherent choices under pressure. This nuanced portrayal reminded me of classic literary heroes who grow not solely through triumphs, but through contemplation, dialogue, and the moral engagement with others. In the end, the characters collectively embody a world that is intellectually stimulating, ethically rich, and emotionally resonant. Each one is carefully positioned to illuminate different aspects of power, justice, identity, and legacy. I found myself reflecting repeatedly on how character, when treated with such care, can serve as both mirror and guide, reflecting societal and personal dilemmas, while also guiding the audience toward introspection and understanding. The interplay between personal ambition, ethical responsibility, historical awareness, and relational loyalty is masterfully explored through the ensemble, making the story a veritable study in human complexity. It is rare for a narrative to sustain this level of character integrity across such a broad ensemble while maintaining thematic coherence. Yet here, the story excels. Characters are neither flattened into archetypes nor overwhelmed by spectacle. Instead, they live, breathe, and evolve, revealing the moral, emotional, and philosophical dimensions of the world they inhabit. As I watched, I was continually aware of how these portrayals resonate on multiple levels: personal, societal, and universal. They invite empathy, reflection, and ethical inquiry, making the narrative far more than entertainment. It becomes a lens through which to examine the nature of humanity itself. By the conclusion, each character has not only fulfilled their narrative function but also contributed to a layered exploration of history, morality, and identity. Chala emerges as a morally conscious leader tempered by introspection and courage. Killmonger remains a tragic reminder of pain unacknowledged and justice unclaimed. Shuri and Nakia shine as embodiments of intellect, courage, and ethical clarity. The ensemble collectively models a world in which moral complexity, historical awareness, and relational responsibility are inseparable from personal and societal action. Observing their journeys, I was reminded again of literature's enduring lesson, that the richness of any story lies as much in the interior lives of its characters as in the events that unfold around them. Throughout the entire narrative, what lingers most is the resonance of character-driven storytelling. Each figure is a microcosm of the story's larger philosophical inquiries, questions of power, justice, identity, legacy, and morality. I found that reflecting on them long after the final scenes offers insights not only into narrative construction but also into human nature itself. They remind me that the most compelling stories, whether literary or cinematic, are those in which characters are simultaneously specific and universal, deeply personal and broadly human, narratively functional and ethically illuminating. There's something strangely satisfying about discovering the little-known truths behind a story we've already fallen in love with. Watching a film can feel like diving into an entire world that's perfectly polished, seamless, and complete. But the reality of making that world is rarely so neat. The strangeness lives in the cracks, the surprising decisions, the accidents that turned into art, the quiet human moments that reshaped the entire course of the production. And when I think about this particular film, I realize just how many odd, fascinating, and downright uncanny things shaped the experience behind the curtain. I've always been drawn to those details that feel almost too strange to be true, as if the universe conspires in little coincidences just to make the finished story richer. I remember first stumbling across some of these facts late one night, falling into a rabbit hole of production notes and interviews, and feeling that particular jolt of wonder when reality collides with art. It reminded me of flipping through the appendices of a beloved novel, where the author lets you in on the hidden scaffolding of the world they've built. One of the strangest things, to me, is how much of the film's texture was influenced not by pure imagination but by deep, meticulous research into African cultures. Of course, most people know the broad strokes, that the costumes, architecture, and rituals were inspired by real traditions across the continent. But what's uncanny is the almost obsessive level of detail. The production team didn't just glance at images and books, they traveled, consulted with historians, and immersed themselves in everything from beadwork techniques to the symbolism of certain colors. I read once that Ruth E. Carter, the costume designer, would spend hours studying photographs of tribes, not to replicate them wholesale, but to weave fragments into something that felt authentic yet futuristic. For instance, the neck rings worn by certain characters. Those came directly from the Ndebele people of South Africa, but they were reimagined in sleek, almost metallic textures to suggest an advanced society. That strange blend of ancient and futuristic isn't just art direction. It's anthropology meeting science fiction, and it's fascinating to me that something so fantastical was built from such precise reality. Even stranger is the fact that some of the film's most iconic visual flourishes came from improvisation. There's a story I always smile at. Apparently, Winston Duke, who played Mbaku, decided to bark during his first face-off with Chala. That wasn't in the script at all. It was simply an instinct, a moment where he felt the need to embody the energy of his tribe with something visceral. And here's the eerie part. The crew almost broke into laughter because it was so unexpected, yet the reaction on set was electric. That strange, spontaneous choice didn't just make it into the film, it became a defining part of his character's presence. Whenever I think of that, I marvel at how the oddest impulses, the ones that come out of nowhere, can become permanent pieces of art. Then there's the peculiar case of accents. The film's commitment to language and dialect was extraordinary. I had assumed before that the characters spoke in a kind of generalized, African accent, the way Hollywood sometimes smooths over cultural differences. But no, what actually happened is stranger and more thoughtful. Chadwick Boseman himself insisted that his character should not speak with a British or American inflection, as had often been the default in earlier portrayals of African royalty in cinema. Instead, he worked with dialect coaches to build a Wakandan accent rooted in Xhosa, one of the official languages of South Africa. Here's the surreal part. Boseman was so persuasive in his insistence that the rest of the cast eventually followed suit, and what began as his personal conviction ended up defining the sound of an entire fictional nation. That choice, strange, unexpected, against the Hollywood grain, reshaped the entire sonic texture of the film. Another oddity that always fascinates me is how the film's climactic duel was shaped not by months of careful planning, but by something close to chaos. The waterfall fight scenes, with their vibrant colors and chanting crowds, look flawless on screen. But behind the scenes, they were a logistical nightmare. The production team had built these elaborate sets with pools of water and rocky ledges, only to realize that shooting in such conditions was grueling. The actors were slipping, the costumes were soaking wet and becoming unbearably heavy, and the extras were freezing. There's a bizarre sort of poetry in the fact that what looks so triumphant and choreographed on screen was, in reality, a struggle to keep people from shivering or falling. I imagine the sheer grit it must have taken for the cast to perform with such intensity under those conditions, and it makes me appreciate those scenes even more. There's also the curious matter of Michael B. Jordan's transformation into his character. His body was covered in hundreds of raised bumps, each one representing a kill. What's unusual here is the process. Those scars were individually applied, piece by piece, in hours-long sessions. Jordan once joked that he would sometimes fall asleep in the chair because it took so long. But here's the stranger part. He revealed that carrying those scars on his skin during filming affected his psychology. He began to feel the weight of his character's anger more acutely, as if the physical transformations seeped into his spirit. It's a phenomenon I've read about in literature too, where actors or writers describe being haunted by their creations. That eerie overlap between physical artifice and emotional truth is one of those strange behind-the-scenes realities that linger long after you've heard it. Another little fact that feels uncanny, the ancestral plane sequences with their purple skies and spiritual resonance, were heavily inspired by African cosmologies but also by something deeply personal. Ryan Coogler, the director, said he drew upon conversations with his own family about the afterlife. There's something strange and beautiful about that a blockbuster superhero film carries within it echoes of a director's private musings with his relatives. When I think of those dreamlike scenes now, I don't just see spectacle, I hear the faint, ghostly echo of family stories and intimate beliefs. It makes the fictional world feel curiously alive, as if it has roots in something both real and sacred. The casting stories, too, carry their own oddities. For instance, Daniel Kaluuya, who played Wabi, was cast before his breakout role in Get Out made him famous. By the time the film premiered, Kaluuya had already become a household name. It's strange to think how different the perception of his character might have been if audiences hadn't already connected him with one of the decade's defining psychological thrillers. In a way, his casting embodies one of those peculiar accidents of timing, where art and circumstance collide in unexpected ways. Another strange tidbit, Chadwick Boseman performed many of his stunts while battling intense physical exhaustion. He never revealed the full extent of his health struggles to the crew, and yet he carried himself with grace and dignity through grueling shoots. Knowing this now casts a haunting shadow over the film. It's one of those facts that retroactively changes the way you experience certain scenes, making them feel heavier, stranger, almost mythic in their resilience. I remember reading that the film almost had a completely different opening sequence. Originally, the script began with a flashback to 1992 Oakland, but the way it unfolded on screen was refined countless times in the editing room. The strange part is how much of that shift came down to rhythm, to a feeling of how the story should breathe. Editors and directors often describe their work in almost musical terms, and here, they seem to treat the narrative like a symphony. The choice to begin in Oakland, grounding the story in a moment of diaspora and hidden history, wasn't just narrative, it was thematic foreshadowing. It's peculiar to think how fragile that choice was, and how easily the film might have opened with something far less resonant. There are even stranger, smaller details sprinkled throughout. The writing on the walls of Wakandan technology labs? That's not gibberish, it's a fully developed language based on an ancient Nigerian script. The production team actually invented a consistent alphabet and syntax for the film, ensuring that every symbol had meaning. It's such an odd thing to pour energy into, considering most viewers would never pause long enough to decode it. And yet, that commitment to detail is what makes the world feel so strangely real, even when it's entirely fictional. The score holds its own curiosities as well. Ludwig Göransson, the composer, didn't simply sit in a studio with synthesizers. He traveled to Africa, recorded traditional instruments, and wove those recordings into the orchestral fabric of the soundtrack. One of the strangest, most moving stories I heard was about his collaboration with local musicians who had never before worked on a Hollywood project. Their sounds, rooted in centuries of tradition, were suddenly booming in theaters worldwide. I find that thought both uncanny and beautiful, a reminder of how art can leap across boundaries in ways that feel almost magical. Even the little quirks of on-set life tell their own story. There's a rumor that Letitia Wright, who played Shuri, often had the crew laughing uncontrollably between takes. Her humor was so infectious that they sometimes had to reset entire scenes because no one could keep a straight face. It's a strange contradiction, isn't it? The film itself is often serious, weighted with legacy and conflict, and yet behind the camera there was this constant hum of laughter. That odd tension between the heaviness of the narrative and the lightness of the human experience behind it makes me love the film even more. Some of the strangest facts, of course, aren't about production at all, but about reception. The film became a cultural phenomenon, but one of the oddest stories I've heard is about a man who rented out entire theaters just to give free tickets to kids in his community. That wasn't orchestrated by the studio, it was simply an act of generosity inspired by the story. To me, that's one of the strangest and most beautiful consequences of art, that it escapes the control of its creators and takes on a life of its own. I could go on endlessly, because the strangeness behind the film seems inexhaustible. Every corner hides a story. The cast's secret WhatsApp group where they shared memes during filming, the last-minute rewrites of certain dialogue to better reflect African proverbs, the surreal experience of shooting scenes on Atlanta soundstages while pretending to stand atop African mountains. It's all strange, in the sense that it blurs the boundary between the artificial and the real, the planned and the improvised, the ordinary and the extraordinary. And maybe that's the heart of why I find these facts so compelling. They remind me that art is never just a finished product. It's a messy, human, unpredictable process, full of accidents, oddities, and moments of strange grace. The polished story we see on screen is only the surface. Beneath it lies a labyrinth of strangeness that is just as fascinating, and sometimes even more moving. And in that way, looking at these facts feels like rereading a novel and discovering the marginal notes, the author's hesitations, the drafts that almost were. They are reminders that art is alive, strange, and endlessly surprising. It's fascinating to revisit the film through the lens of its pivotal moments and consider how each event resonates far beyond the screen. There's something almost literary about it. Each scene is like a chapter in a novel, each decision rippling outward with meaning that only grows the deeper you look. I remember the first time I sat down and tried to unpack it that way, not just watching the spectacle of vibranium and heroics, but really thinking about the choices, the consequences, the emotional architecture of the story. It felt almost like archaeology, carefully brushing away layers of plot to reveal the structure beneath. One of the first moments that strikes me as critical is the opening sequence in Oakland, where we meet the father and son, establishing the stakes not just in a global sense but in a profoundly personal one. From a critical perspective, this scene does something extraordinary. It immediately frames the film as a story of inheritance, identity, and responsibility. You can feel it in the subtle performances, the way Boseman's character is confronted with his father's legacy, and the quiet weight of cultural memory. What's strange, and yet brilliant, is how this single, intimate scene lays the groundwork for the massive world-building that follows. It's almost deceptively small for a blockbuster, no explosive battles or flashy tech, but it resonates because it establishes moral and emotional stakes that echo throughout the film. The coronation sequence is another event worth dissecting. On the surface, it's a traditional ritual, a kind of visual spectacle of royal power and ceremony. But critically, it functions as a lens through which we can examine the film's broader questions of leadership and tradition. The juxtaposition of ceremony and the political tension brewing outside the palace walls serves as a reminder that power is never clean or uncomplicated. I love how the filmmakers use pageantry not merely for aesthetics, but as a narrative device. The viewer is constantly aware that beneath the beauty lies friction, conflict, and the weight of expectations. It's the kind of moment that's easy to miss if you're watching casually, but when you pause to think about it, It feels almost like a meditation on the burdens of inheritance. Then there's the first major confrontation with the antagonist. From a critical standpoint, it's striking how this film reshapes the idea of a villain. The first face-off isn't simply about good versus evil, it's about ideology, history, and morality. We see two men who mirror one another in their drive and strength, yet their choices diverge sharply. This event pushes the narrative into moral complexity, compelling the audience to grapple with questions of justice, revenge, and societal responsibility. In literary terms, it's almost like a dialogue between conflicting philosophies made flesh, and the film does an incredible job of dramatizing those tensions. The emotional resonance here is palpable because it isn't just action, it's an ethical confrontation, and the reverberations of that moment echo throughout the rest of the story. Another pivotal event, the chase through the streets of Busan, or more broadly, the moments outside the palace walls, serves as a narrative bridge between tradition and modernity. Critically, these sequences are fascinating because they depict Wakanda not as a static utopia but as a living, breathing society. We witness tension between isolationism and engagement with the wider world. The cinematography emphasizes movement, fluidity, and unpredictability, mirroring the thematic conflicts the characters face. There's also a subtle critique embedded here. Progress and tradition are not easily reconciled, and the film invites the audience to contemplate the costs and benefits of each path. In this sense, the action sequences are not just thrilling, they are philosophically charged, layered with meaning beneath the kinetic energy. The emergence of the antagonist's full plan marks one of the most dramatically resonant events. Critically, it is fascinating to see how narrative structure builds tension and expectation, only to reveal that the threat is not merely physical but ideological. The character's vision challenges Wakanda's isolationist policies and forces both the protagonist and the audience to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility to the global community. This thematic layering is unusual for a blockbuster. It turns what could have been a simple conflict into a complex meditation on ethics, nationalism, and justice. Emotionally, it strikes a chord because it asks viewers to consider not just what is right for the individual, but what is right for the collective, a theme that resonates long after the film ends. The courtroom-like duel sequences that follow provide yet another avenue for critical reflection. They aren't merely about combat, they are about moral and ethical reckoning. The choreography of these battles is intentionally reflective of ritualistic trials, each move loaded with symbolic weight. I'm always struck by how the filmmakers use physicality to explore character psychology. Each strike, each defensive move, is a visual metaphor for the internal and societal conflicts that have been simmering throughout the story. There's an elegance to it, a poetry that elevates the violence beyond spectacle into something deeply meaningful. Emotionally, these scenes are cathartic. They allow the audience to witness not only the resolution of physical conflict but also the reconciliation of competing moral frameworks. Another critical event is the protagonist's eventual reflection on leadership and responsibility. In literary terms, this is the moment of thematic synthesis. The film ties together questions of heritage, duty, and identity. The audience is asked to witness the character's internal journey as much as the external conflicts. What's strange, in a delightful way, is how the filmmakers balance intimate reflection with the grandeur of a superhero narrative. Boseman's performance is quietly mesmerizing here. He conveys not only authority but the vulnerability and uncertainty inherent in assuming responsibility for an entire nation. Emotionally, this moment resonates because it is deeply human. Even heroes are weighed down by the consequences of their choices. The climactic resolution is another rich site for critical exploration. On one level, it functions as the expected payoff. Conflicts are resolved, justice is served, and order is restored. But on a deeper level, the resolution is intentionally ambiguous, resisting simplistic closure. The film presents the triumph of vision and compassion over brute force, but it also leaves lingering questions about global ethics, the responsibility of power, and the consequences of isolationism. Critically, this choice reflects a sophisticated understanding of narrative complexity. Audiences are invited not merely to cheer but to think, to reflect, and perhaps to feel unsettled. That unresolved tension is part of what gives the film lasting emotional and intellectual resonance. I often return in thought to the role of secondary events, moments that may seem minor, but which, under scrutiny, reveal themselves as thematically rich. Shuri's technological innovations, for example, are more than just cool gadgets. They embody the interplay of curiosity, intellect, and ethical responsibility. Each invention reflects her character's worldview. Innovation is a tool, not an end in itself, and its use carries moral consequences. Observing these smaller arcs critically, I see how the film's emotional depth is compounded by attention to detail, how even minor developments reinforce major themes. The balance of narrative threads here is masterful, and the emotional resonance comes from the way all these threads interweave. Even the depiction of cultural ritual throughout the film invites critical engagement. From the ceremonial challenges to the symbolic use of vibranium, these events carry both narrative and philosophical weight. They are not window dressing. They are mechanisms for exploring the tension between tradition and progress, personal desire and collective responsibility. Critically, the film uses these moments to interrogate ideas of power, identity, and community. Emotionally, they invite the audience into a space of reverence and reflection, a rare accomplishment for a film operating within the superhero genre. The antagonist's ultimate confrontation with the protagonist provides another lens for analysis. Unlike many blockbusters, the resolution of conflict here is not achieved solely through violence, but through a combination of moral reasoning, emotional connection, and social insight. This approach reflects a critical sensibility that prizes psychological and ethical depth over mere spectacle. It is strange, perhaps, for a film of this scale, but it's what gives the narrative its intellectual weight. The climax resonates because it feels earned. The audience has been invited to think as well as feel, to grapple with ethical questions alongside the characters themselves. Throughout the film, minor events, small dialogues, fleeting gestures, moments of silence, accumulate to create an emotional texture that is subtle but profound. For example, the fleeting exchanges between the protagonist and his confidants reveal the tension between personal desire and societal duty. Critically, these moments serve as emotional counterpoints to the spectacle, grounding the narrative in human experience. The filmmakers understand that emotion is built cumulatively. Every glance, pause, or hesitation contributes to the audience's understanding of character motivation and thematic resonance. Even the use of environment as a narrative device is noteworthy. The film's visual landscapes, lush jungles, technologically advanced cities, and stark battlefields function as extensions of character psychology and thematic exploration. Critically, this spatial storytelling reinforces questions of belonging, isolation, and community. Emotionally, the settings are immersive. They elicit wonder, tension, and a sense of responsibility, mirroring the narrative stakes. It's unusual in blockbuster filmmaking to see such attention paid to environmental symbolism, yet here it underpins nearly every major event. Perhaps one of the strangest yet most rewarding aspects of critical engagement is observing how the audience themselves become part of the narrative experience. Major events like the revelation of secret resources or the challenge to traditional authority sparked real-world discussions about ethics, race, and leadership. Critically, this illustrates the power of film as a cultural text. Events on screen reverberate beyond the theater, shaping conversations, inspiring debate, and sometimes even prompting social action. That ripple effect, the way story intersects with society, is part of what gives the narrative lasting impact. Even the climactic technology sequences warrant scrutiny. Beyond spectacle, they serve as visual metaphors for the interplay of knowledge, power, and responsibility. Critically, these moments illustrate how innovation without ethical grounding can be both awe-inspiring and dangerous. The filmmakers use these sequences to interrogate questions about progress, human ambition, and moral accountability, reminding the audience that every choice, every action, carries consequences beyond immediate perception. Emotionally, this resonates because the tension between wonder and danger mirrors real-life dilemmas faced by individuals and societies alike. The film's denouement, while celebratory, leaves room for reflection. The resolution of character arcs is satisfying, yet it invites contemplation. How will these decisions affect the wider world? Critically, this is a rare gift in a superhero film. The narrative refuses to provide neat answers, instead encouraging ongoing engagement with its themes. Emotionally, it feels both triumphant and contemplative, a blend of catharsis and introspection that is unusual for films in this genre. Even in retrospect, smaller events, the personal conversations, the moments of levity, the interactions between secondary characters, contribute to critical understanding. They illustrate the film's commitment to emotional authenticity, its nuanced portrayal of relationships, and its exploration of complex social dynamics. Each seemingly minor choice reinforces major themes, creating a layered narrative that rewards thoughtful analysis. Ultimately, examining the film through a critical lens reveals a work of profound thematic and emotional resonance. Major events, duels, coronations, technological innovations, confrontations, serve not merely as plot points but as vehicles for exploring morality, identity, and responsibility. The audience is invited to engage intellectually and emotionally, to wrestle with questions of justice, leadership, and ethical action. In doing so, the film transcends genre conventions, offering a rich and multifaceted experience that lingers long after the credits roll. It's one of those experiences that makes you marvel not just at what appears on screen, but at the invisible machinery behind it, the orchestration of creativity, skill, and sheer human will that brings a story to life. Thinking about the production of this film, I often find myself imagining the countless hands, minds, and hearts involved in translating the vision from script to screen. It's almost like peering into a hidden world, a world that is chaotic and magical at once, full of serendipity, challenges, and triumphs. The first time I read about some of the production details, I remember feeling both awestruck and deeply inspired. There's an intimacy in knowing that even the smallest decision on set can ripple outward to shape the entire narrative experience for audiences. One of the most fascinating aspects of the production is how the filmmakers approached world building. Wakanda isn't just a backdrop, it's a character in itself, alive with culture, history, and identity. What's remarkable is the research that went into creating this imagined society. The production team drew inspiration from diverse African cultures, textiles, architecture, and rituals, blending them into a cohesive visual language. I remember reading about the design process for Wakanda's cityscapes, how the team studied patterns, motifs, and architectural elements from across the continent. They didn't merely copy, they synthesized, imagining a future that felt both technologically advanced and deeply rooted in cultural heritage. Critically, this attention to detail gave the film a richness and authenticity that is rare in mainstream cinema, and emotionally, it makes the world feel alive, inhabited, and resonant. The costume design, too, is a story worth savoring. I recall stories of Ruth E. Carter, the brilliant designer behind the film, and the way she approached each character's attire as a narrative device. Every thread, color, and texture tells a story about lineage, personality, and power. For example, the ceremonial suits worn by the royal family weren't just aesthetic. They signified rank, tradition, and the merging of past and future. The suits of the Dora Milaje, meanwhile, reflected both their warrior ethos and their cultural identity. Carter reportedly spent months traveling to Africa, consulting with historians and artisans, collecting fabrics and patterns that informed the designs. What struck me most was how the costumes allowed the audience to understand character before a single word was spoken, a testament to the power of visual storytelling. Filming locations also hold fascinating stories. The team scouted landscapes from South Korea to the lush jungles of Africa, seeking spaces that could feel simultaneously real and fantastical. I remember reading about the challenges of shooting in such diverse environments, logistical hurdles, weather, and the coordination of massive set pieces, but also the serendipitous moments. For instance, certain shots were influenced entirely by the light of the natural surroundings, leading to spontaneous adjustments that became iconic sequences. The cinematography team had to balance the vibrancy of natural landscapes with the glow of advanced technology, and the result is a visual tapestry that is both breathtaking and narratively purposeful. It's a reminder that filmmaking is as much about adaptation and improvisation as it is about meticulous planning. The visual effects are another layer of wonder. What I find endlessly fascinating is how the filmmakers envisioned the futuristic tech of Wakanda while grounding it in plausibility. The vibranium suits, the advanced transportation, and even the holographic communication devices were all conceived with a consistent internal logic. Behind the screen, hundreds of artists and technicians worked tirelessly to ensure that these effects felt tactile and believable. I love imagining the sheer collaboration required. Teams of designers, animators, and engineers debating how a suit should fold or how light should bounce off a hologram. These decisions, while technical, have profound narrative impact. They make the world feel real, immersive, and emotionally compelling. Some behind-the-scenes anecdotes are downright delightful. I remember one story about how Chadwick Boseman approached his role with an extraordinary level of preparation and care. He would arrive on set early to study his posture, his gestures, and even the way his character might move through space. He wanted the king to feel both regal and human, to embody authority without losing warmth or vulnerability. Crew members spoke about his humility and curiosity, how he would consult with costume designers or stunt coordinators, asking thoughtful questions rather than merely following directions. It's a reminder that great performances are rarely spontaneous. They are born of respect for the craft and dedication to the story. Similarly, the action sequences carry fascinating production tales. The fight choreography, especially the scenes involving the Dora Milaje, required months of preparation and rigorous training. The actors trained in various martial arts, some for hours a day, to make the movements authentic and expressive. What's interesting is that the choreography wasn't just about spectacle, it reflected character and culture. Each strike and counterstrike conveyed not only skill but also philosophy, discipline, and narrative intent. On set, there were moments of improvisation, too, when a spontaneous movement would be incorporated into the final cut because it felt narratively and visually perfect. These little surprises remind us that creativity in filmmaking is often emergent, born of the moment as much as the script. Even the soundtrack holds behind-the-scenes magic. The collaboration with Ludwig Göransson, who infused the score with traditional African instrumentation, rhythms, and textures, is a story of cultural synthesis. I remember reading about the research process. Göransson traveled to Africa to study drums, chants, and melodies, working with local musicians to ensure authenticity. What's fascinating is how he then merged these traditional elements with orchestral and electronic layers to create a soundscape that feels epic yet intimately tied to character and place. This meticulous work gives the film its emotional heartbeat. The music doesn't just accompany the story, it amplifies and interprets it. The emotional resonance is palpable, particularly in ceremonial scenes or moments of quiet reflection. The production also faced logistical marvels. The film involved complex sequences requiring hundreds of extras, intricate stunts, and simultaneous filming across locations. Coordinating these efforts was nothing short of monumental. I love the stories of crew members navigating sudden weather changes, last-minute script adjustments, and the constant push and pull of artistic vision and practical reality. There's an almost heroic quality to these behind-the-scenes efforts, the unsung labor that transforms imaginative ideas into cinematic reality. There are also little-known details and trivia that reveal the film's depth. For instance, many props were functional and designed to be interactive for actors, allowing for more natural performances. Even the Wakandan tech interfaces, the masks, and ceremonial artifacts were crafted with layers of symbolic meaning. Some props were inspired by historical objects, others were entirely original inventions meant to spark wonder while remaining narratively consistent. I find it beautiful that these small touches, invisible to many viewers, contribute to the cohesion and believability of the story world. Casting, too, offers fascinating insight into production dynamics. The ensemble approach wasn't just about star power, it was a deliberate effort to create chemistry and authenticity among the characters. The actors underwent workshops together, rehearsing dialogue, combat sequences, and cultural rituals. These shared experiences translated into on-screen camaraderie and tension. From a storytelling perspective, this preparation allowed relationships to feel lived in and emotionally truthful. It's a reminder that human connection in front of the camera is often forged through intensive collaboration off-screen. I also love stories about how unexpected moments became iconic. There were instances when actors improvised lines or gestures, and the directors, recognizing the authenticity, incorporated them into the final cut. Such moments are magical because they reveal how fluid and dynamic filmmaking can be. The final product is a blend of planning, spontaneity, and creative intuition. It's a testament to the collaborative nature of art. Even a single inspired improvisation can transform a scene, giving it texture and resonance that no script could anticipate. The director's vision deserves its own reflection. Ryan Coogler's approach combined meticulous planning with a willingness to let the story breathe. On set, he balanced technical precision with emotional intuition, encouraging actors to explore their characters' inner lives while ensuring that visual storytelling remained coherent. One anecdote I particularly love involves the design of the throne room. The set was intended to convey grandeur, tradition, and a sense of continuity with Wakanda's history. Coogler's attention to symbolic detail, such as the placement of artifacts and the interplay of light and shadow, created a space that felt both real and mythic. These choices amplify the emotional and thematic resonance of every scene filmed there.